I never thought much about my Aunt Margaret. She was my mom's older sister, but she had always been distant, a quiet and enigmatic presence at family gatherings. I couldn't recall the last time I had seen her before that weekend, and even then, I barely remembered anything about her beyond the occasional odd comment or lingering stare. So, when my parents announced they were leaving for a much-needed weekend getaway and that Aunt Margaret would be staying with me, I wasn't thrilled. I was 17, old enough to be alone, but my recent suspension from school made my parents skeptical of my responsibility. The night before they left, my mom told me, "Just listen to your aunt and behave. Ethan will be back Sunday night." My dad had simply nodded, throwing me a warning look as they packed their bags. When Aunt Margaret arrived, I felt a chill despite the warm summer air. She was tall and thin, her dark clothes pressed neatly, her silver-streaked hair in a tight bun. Her presence was commanding yet unsettling. She smiled, but it never quite reached her eyes. "Hello, Ethan," she said, her voice smooth but distant. "It will be just the two of us. I hope we will have a memorable time." That first night was quiet, too quiet. Aunt Margaret barely spoke, instead sitting in the dimly lit living room with a book so old its pages looked brittle. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the unbearable silence. I retreated to my room, playing games on my phone until I drifted to sleep. But something woke me in the middle of the night. A noise, a faint whispering. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. It was coming from the hallway. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear. A soft, rhythmic chant. I opened the door a crack and peeked outside. Aunt Margaret stood in the hallway, facing away from me, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. The shadows cast by the hallway lamp twisted around her. She was completely still except for her lips, which moved rapidly, uttering those strange words. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away slowly, closing the door without a sound. Climbing back into bed, I pulled the covers over myself and squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe she was just praying. That's what I told myself. The next morning, I woke up to find the doors in the house locked. Not just the front and back doors. My own bedroom door had been locked from the outside. I pounded on it, shouting, until I heard slow footsteps approaching. The lock clicked, and Aunt Margaret stood there, her expression unreadable. "For safety," she said simply. "You can never be too careful." I didn't argue, but my skin prickled with unease. Later that day, while she was outside tending to the garden, I took the opportunity to search her room. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just anything, to explain her odd behavior. In her drawer, I found a stack of newspaper clippings. Missing boys in local area, vanished without a trace. No leads and disappearances. My breath hitched. The photos, some were old, yellowed with time, but the faces were all young, boys around my age. My fingers trembled as I flipped through them. Then, at the bottom of the pile, I found a picture of myself. It was taken from a distance, as if someone had been watching me. I felt sick. Then, the floorboard creaked. I turned. Aunt Margaret stood in the doorway, watching me. Her eyes darkened, and she tilted her head slightly. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, Ethan," she said softly. That night, I heard something moving in the basement. Scraping, a faint rustling. I forced myself to investigate, heart hammering in my chest. I found a trapdoor in the corner, hidden under old blankets. Lifting it, I descended into a hidden chamber below the basement. Bones, rusted chains, symbols drawn in dark, dried stains on the walls. Then, a whisper behind me. "You were always meant to stay with me." I turned just in time to see her lunging at me. I fought, kicking and thrashing as she tried to drag me into the darkness. I managed to grab an old iron poker from the ground and swung it wildly, connecting with her head. She let out a guttural, unnatural hiss and stumbled back. Using the moment, I scrambled out, slamming the trapdoor shut and locking it. I could hear her screeching below, clawing at the wood, cursing in that same strange language. I ran out of the basement, through the house, only to find every exit locked. The windows wouldn't budge. My phone was gone. Then I saw it. The old key I had found earlier in her drawer. I grabbed it and rushed to the front door, fumbling as I heard her footsteps racing up the basement stairs. The lock clicked. I threw the door open and sprinted into the night. I didn't stop running. Not until I reached a neighbor's house, banging on the door until they answered. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty. No trace of Aunt Margaret. No hidden chamber in the basement. Just an old, empty house. My parents dismissed it as stress, my imagination playing tricks. They even suggested Aunt Margaret had simply left. But I knew better. As I lay in bed that night, exhausted, I heard something. A whisper, coming from the vent. We are not done yet. I never went back to that house. After that night, my parents decided to move. They didn't understand what had happened, but they figured a fresh start would help me. I tried to tell them. I begged them to believe me, but they just shook their heads, chalking it up to stress. Maybe they thought I was still acting out because of my suspension. Maybe they just didn't want to believe something so horrible could be real. But I knew the truth, and I knew she wasn't gone. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her cold, empty stare, the way her mouth twisted into that unnatural smile. The whispering never stopped. At night, I heard it through the walls, through the vents, even when I covered my ears. It was always there, just out of reach, a ghost of a sound. One night, I woke up gasping for air, the feeling of icy fingers wrapped around my throat. My room was dark, but in the corner, barely visible in the moonlight, was a shadow. A tall, thin shape that didn't move, didn't breathe. I reached for my lamp, but as soon as the light flicked on, it was gone. The next morning, I found something under my bed. A single scrap of paper, yellowed and torn at the edges. Written in shaky, spidery handwriting were 3 words. You are mine. I ran to my parents, shoving the paper in their faces, but they dismissed it. My mom even laughed nervously, telling me I was scaring myself. My dad just sighed and said, "You need to let this go, Ethan. Aunt Margaret is gone." But she wasn't, and she wasn't alone. The nightmares grew worse. I started seeing things in the corner of my eye, shadows stretching toward me, hands reaching from nowhere. My reflection in the mirror didn't always move when I did. I started locking my door at night, barricading myself in my room. But the whispers found their way in, no matter what I did. Then, one night, something changed. The whispers weren't coming from inside my room anymore. They were coming from my parents' bedroom. Heart pounding, I crept down the hall, pressing my ear against their door. At first, all I heard was a slow, steady sound of my dad snoring. Then, a whisper, "Ethan." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't coming from either of my parents. It was hers. The door creaked open a fraction of an inch, just enough for me to see inside. The room was pitch black, but there was something standing by their bed. Aunt Margaret. She stood over them, her long fingers hovering inches from my mother's face. Her head snapped toward me, and in that moment, I knew she had never left. She had followed me here. She had always been here. I ran, down the stairs, through the kitchen. I needed to get out, to get away. But the front door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. The house had become a prison, just like before, and then I heard her footsteps coming down the stairs. "You can't run from family, Ethan," she whispered. "We are bound." I turned just as the shadows wrapped around me, pulling me into the dark. I woke up in my bed. Everything was normal. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Birds chirped outside. For a second, I thought it had all been a dream. Then I saw my reflection in the mirror. It was smiling, and I wasn't.